Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean Macmillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so this one is a book review, and the book being reviewed is Managing Records, a Handbook of Principles and Practice by Shepherd and Yule. Okay, so first of all, an overview of the book. The book was originally published in 2003. The two authors of the book, Shepherd and Yule, have a wealth of experience and knowledge. Elizabeth Shepherd had a background in archives and records management and local government before becoming a director in the master's programme at UCL. Geoffrey Yule, he worked extensively in archives and records management and worked on projects in the UK and Africa. Yule was also a director at University College London. And just one thing I would say before I get into more detailed analysis of this book is if there's one thing that really shows, it's the practical experience of the two authors. Then the book is really good from an academic point of view, but there's also a lot of really good practical recommendations, and that's one thing that I think makes the book so important and so useful. The book blurb describes it as a manual that provided a detailed guide to the concepts, skills and techniques of records management, and even although the book's about 17 years old, I would still say it still pretty much covers this. The book has about 8 main chapters, which I'm going to review individually. And lastly, I would say that this video is absolutely not a substitute for reading the book. The idea is that I'm going to give you an idea of what's in the book, and hopefully from that you'll be motivated to go out and buy it. One thing I would say is that if you are interested in records management, hopefully this video might give you an idea of some of the key concepts that records managers look at. And even if you are more interested in the archival side, I would say having a knowledge of these sort of subjects and these sort of concepts, I think, can be really useful. So as I say, overall, I recommend the book for anyone that's interested in archives or records management. Okay, Chapter 1, Understanding Records Management. So this chapter is a really good introduction, and it defines what records are and the connection between records and an activity. The chapter notes how records are created and captured, and discusses some of the key models such as the lifecycle and continuum models. My first essay for my master's was on the continuum model, and I remember I started with this book. It gave a really good introduction to the continuum model. For those of you that haven't seen it or yet to come across it, the continuum model was a model developed by Frank Upward as a sort of something that offers a little bit more nuance and development in the life cycle model. And when you look at it for the first time, it can be a bit difficult to get your head around. But I found that Shepherd and Yule's book kind of introduced it in a way that made a lot more sense to me. The chapter generally discusses the evidential value of records and introduces us to records management systems. So it's a really good introduction, this chapter, and it gives a really good starting point from which to look at the other concepts in the book. So Chapter 2, Analysing the Context for Records Management. So this chapter looks at the way a records manager can better understand the organisations whose records they are managing. This includes how to collect data, undertaking environmental analysis, the value of a PEST test, that's P-E-S-T, looking at records as legal evidence, understanding organisational culture, structures, functions and activities. And this chapter also looks at elementary and aggregated records and how to survey records. Personally, I think this chapter is really good because it indicates the steps between organisational purposes, functions and activities. And I think just generally, like, again, if you're sort of new to records management or archives, I think this is a really good lesson to learn early, is that records and archives they're not created in a vacuum. They're created within a system, they're created within a structure, they're created within an environment. And the better you understand that environment or that context, the far better you'll be able to manage the records and ultimately archives as well. So that's a really good early lesson to learn if you're interested in a career in archives or records management. Okay, chapter 3, classifying records and documenting context. So this chapter notes the importance and use of classification in addition to the value of classifying by function. So that's classifying by function, say, as opposed to classifying by provenance or an initial series system. It lays out the steps for defining a classification system, and there's also a lot of content on arranging records by series and file architecture. This chapter is really good for me in the sense that it discusses the difference between metadata for paper records and electronic records. The chapter also discusses classifying records and hybrid systems, and in that respect, I kind of think the book is slightly ahead of its time. There was a theory at one point that with the onset of digital technologies, that we would one day eventually be living in a sort of paperless office situation where offices and institutions didn't have paper records anymore. And in 2003, it might have seemed possible that by 2020 we'd be at that stage. That's really not happened, and I would say that the vast majority of organisations are still hybrid to some extent. So that's really interesting about the book. And I think the fact that they notice distinction between metadata for paper records and digital records maybe makes the book slightly ahead of its time. Okay, chapter 4, creating and capturing. So this chapter starts by discussing the need to identify where records are needed before noting ways you can ensure authenticity and avoid legal issues. A lot of this chapter discusses creating and capturing records and includes considering what should be captured and in what form. This chapter looks at workflows and electronic records specifically. And lastly, I would say that this chapter also looks at registry systems, essential metadata, and unique identifiers. I honestly have to say I can't underemphasize the importance of unique identifiers. Whether you're working on an archival catalogue or a records management system, being able to gain intellectual control of the information you have as soon as possible is one of the biggest recommendations I can give. Okay, chapter 5, appraisal, retention, and disposition. So the 5th chapter in the book begins by discussing the need for retention controls before delving into appraisal. This book also gives a really good account of the theories put forward by Grigg, Jenkinson, and Schellenberg before discusses some of the newer approaches such as macro appraisal. I have to say I always really appreciate it when authors do this. Although archives and records management is still in some ways quite a young field, that there is a real wealth of literature from people that were involved in the sector in the sort of early 20th century. And I do think that a lot of the work from Jenkinson and Schellenberg in particular is really still valid today. And I think it's really good that they identify that and they discuss it, because it really does contextualize a lot of what has developed since. There's ample material in this chapter on retention schedules and retention legacy records. And I would say this chapter is also quite good for indicating some of the standards that can be used. Okay, chapter 6, maintaining records and ensuring integrity. So this chapter begins by noting that systems can either be centralized or decentralized. There's also more about what a record center is and what it contains. This chapter discusses outsourcing and transfer options, and there's also corresponding content relating to electronic records and legal issues. And there's also some content which is essentially relates to digital preservation, such as migration formats and metadata. And lastly, there's some really excellent material on ensuring integrity, identity, providing access. So this chapter begins by identifying users and the requirements. There's also really good information on approaches to retrieval, browsing, and searching. I would say that the advice in controlled language is especially relevant, especially in constructing a thesaurus. Anytime I've worked in any sort of records management system, I've often found that controlling and standardizing your language as early as possible is a really practical first step. The information and confidentiality and rights is especially relevant today in the GDPR era, and the chapter finishes on providing access to external users on how to run an archive service essentially. Chapter 8, Implementation, Practical and Managerial Issues. So the final chapter starts by giving details on how to establish a records management policy. The chapter introduces us to the ISO 15489 methodology and gives guidance for identifying business requirements in addition to identifying resources. The chapter also includes some really useful records management job descriptions and finally gives some advice on how to maintain the impetus of a records management program and the things you can do to document the process. So again, this is another very practical chapter, and I think that seems to be one of the themes that runs through this book of how practical it is. And lastly, just some conclusions. So overall, this is a really good book, and it's written by two people with really fantastic experience of records management. Not only do they have an obvious theoretical understanding of the concepts, but they obviously have some experience applying it, and that really shows in the book. I think there's a lot of sort of smaller details that I don't think you can get simply from studying, and I think that's one of the real highlights of this book. The other thing I would say about the book is it crams in so much information for only 8 chapters. I mean, I think the book is, I think it's less than 300 pages. I don't have it in front of me right now, but for the size of the book, the quality of content is really good. It covers a lot in a sort of short space. The book is far more records management orientated than archives, although not completely. And to be honest with you, I really do think even if you are approaching these videos purely from an archival perspective, I really do think that there's some benefit in understanding more about the records management structure. Sometimes I feel as an archivist, you can be a bit distant from the context in which the archives you're working on were originally created, which was initially as records. And I think that having been reminded of that, I really don't think is a bad thing. So overall, the book gives a really good account of the basic concepts and models of records management, and I also have to say that the appendix and follow-up information was also quite good. And yeah, so the book was published about 17 years ago, and although there's been undoubted changes in the sector, especially in relation to legal, technological, just maybe basic environmental, I would say that many of the concepts and themes in the book are still highly relevant today, and it's very much worth still reading, and I think it's still on a lot of the course reading lists, and for good reason. So yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, I would be more than delighted to hear them. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.